Good evening, everybody. My name is Tom Banchoff. I'm director of the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs here at Georgetown. And on behalf of the center and a whole slew of organizations, and in particular the Woodstock Theological Center, which really, together with Mary Ann, helped to put together tonight's program, I'd like to welcome you to our conversation on the future of Catholic peacebuilding. We're going to have a very distinguished set of scholars and practitioners to share their views with you on a critical set of issues. It's a kind of a prequel, as I think many of you know, to a conference to begin next weekend at Notre Dame on this topic, the future of Catholic peacebuilding. And that's an event at which many of us will be participating. There was a prequel earlier at Catholic University across town with our colleagues there. So we're spreading the word about this important work, and we're glad you can join us. The context, as many of you know, is multifold, but I would emphasize that we're here at the 25th anniversary of the publication of the U.S. Catholic Bishop's letter, The Challenge of Peace, which many of us recall, a letter that called for the further development of a theology of peace and its implementation in practice in the best of the Catholic tradition. And we now have, since that date, several decades of practice to look back on, to reflect on critically, to think about what has been done, what has worked, what has not worked perhaps so well, what can be done better. In other words, to take stock of past efforts and to look to the future. And as I said, we have a very distinguished group with us who I would like to introduce in the order in which they will speak. Our first speaker will be Dr. William Headley, Dean of the Joan B. Kroc School of Peace Studies at the University of San Diego and former director of Catholic Relief Services Peacebuilding Program. And he'll speak to us tonight on the topic, Catholic Peacebuilding and Integral Human Development, Tensions and Insights from Practice. We will then hear from Dr. Mary Ann Cusimano-Love, Associate Professor and Fellow at the Life Cycle Institute, the Department of Politics, and the Center for International Social Development at the Catholic University of America. I see Georgetown's not the only place with a Byzantine set of organizations and affiliations, but I think I got that. I'm sure there are a few others we could add. She'll speak with us on the topic, what kind of peace do we seek? Emerging norms in peace-building institutions. We'll then hear from my colleague, Peter Fan, my colleague here at Georgetown, the Ignacio Ella Curia Professor of Catholic Social Thought in the Department of Theology, on the topic Peacebuilding and Reconciliation, Interfaith Dialogue, and Catholic Spirituality. Finally, we'll hear from Father Ferdinand Muhigirwa of the Society of Jesus and the Centre d'études pour l'action sociale of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And he'll be speaking to us on the topic peace building in Africa. After that, you see we have a long program. I'm going to get to how we're going to squeeze this into 90 minutes in just a minute. After that, we'll hear from two respondents, two of my colleagues, Catherine Marshall, a senior fellow at the Berkeley Center who joined Georgetown last year after a long career of leadership positions in the World Bank, and Dr. John Borelli, who I think many of you know, who's long been a leader in interfaith dialogue and now serves as special assistant to the president, to President John J. DeJoy here in Georgetown for interreligious initiatives. As I said, we have quite a few sponsors, and I won't go through the whole list, but this is truly a collaborative effort. We also have some distinguished guests, and I'd like to introduce one to make some framing remarks for us, a leader in the field, someone who's been active in thinking these matters through, but also in the practice of Catholic peace building. And that is the Archbishop of Bukavu, Francois Marois. So I would ask you to please join us at the podium. We have a translator and perhaps share some thoughts with us. Thank you very much for joining us. Yeah.
Bonsoir, chers frères et sœurs.
Good night, brothers. Good evening, brothers and sisters.
C'est un honneur pour moi, même si c'est improvisé, de m'accorder la parole dans cette salle de la bibliothèque de cette grande université du monde.
It's a great honor to be here, even if it was impromptu, in this wonderful library of this great university.
Je commence par présenter mes excuses pour deux raisons majeures.
I first will give some excuses for two particular reasons.
D'abord, je ne parle pas anglais.
First, I don't speak English.
Ça n'honore pas quelqu'un dans cette salle. La deuxième chose, c'est que je suis un peu dérangé au niveau de la voix.
The second thing is that I have some problems with my voice. I have a cold.
Et comme je le disais, c'est un très grand honneur pour moi que je reçoive la parole en premier, malgré l'improvisation.
But nonetheless, it's a great honor for me to be able to speak to you, even if it is a bit improvised.
Nous voulons parler de la construction de la paix.
We plan to speak about building peace,
Et particulièrement dans notre continent, l'Afrique en général et le Congo en particulier.
and in the continent of Africa in general and the Republic of Congo in particular.
Je l'ai déjà dit à certains endroits, si nous voulons parler de la paix, c'est parce qu'il y a eu conflit avant.
As I've said on several occasions, if we're going to speak about peace, it implies that there has been a conflict beforehand.
Et parler de conflit signifie qu'il y a eu au moins deux groupes ou deux personnes qui ont fait la guerre.
And when you talk of conflict, it means that there have been at least two parties that have been involved in a war.
Et nous pensons qu'au niveau de notre continent, l'Afrique, comme France Fanon l'avait déjà souligné, le Congo joue un rôle capital.
And we believe that in looking at Africa, as Frantz Fanon said, Congo plays a pivotal role.
Parce qu'il a dit que l'Afrique a la forme d'un revolver dont la gâchette se trouverait au Congo.
As he said, Africa is in the shape of a gun and the trigger is in Congo.
Et la dernière guerre que nous avons connue en Afrique, au Congo, l'a très bien démontré.
And the last war that we've experienced in the Congo demonstrates this very clearly.
Parce qu'à cause des conflits qui ont eu lieu en Afrique, on a parlé d'une première guerre mondiale en Afrique.
Because we are talking of a First World War in Africa.
Mais la guerre qui a eu lieu en Afrique a été une guerre, au Congo a été une guerre plutôt importée et imposée.
But the war that we have lived through in the Congo has been, in fact, an imported and an imposed war.
Une guerre qui a été une guerre d'agression et que les évêques de l'Afrique centrale ont qualifié de guerre par procuration.
It's been a war of aggression, and it's one that the bishops of this part of Africa have characterized as a war by proxy.
Il y a eu des pays voisins qui ont été armés et bien armés, bien équipés. Ils sont venus faire la guerre au Congo.
Some of the neighboring countries were armed, well equipped, and they used this and came and made war.
Les raisons majeures, on a souligné, ce sont les ambitions d'exploitation des ressources naturelles, la réduction du peuple congolais et surtout la partition de ces géants d'Afrique centrale qu'on a qualifié d'ingouvernables, un pays continent.
The reasons, there are multiple reasons why they did this. One was looking for natural resources. Another is to reduce the number of the Congolese people, but also to see the division of the enormous country of the Congo, which has so often been described as ungovernable.
Dans ces conditions, pour qu'il y ait la paix au Congo, en particulier et en Afrique en général, il faut travailler sur la réconciliation de tous ces acteurs.
Under these circumstances, in order to look to peace in Congo, but also in Africa more generally, you must look at the question of reconciling the different parties involved.
Et les acteurs sont bien entendu les Congolais en premier lieu, mais aussi les pays agresseurs ainsi que tous ceux qui ont armé les uns et les autres.
And the parties are therefore, in the first instance, of course, the Congolese people, but it is also those who have been the aggressors and those who stand behind them and who have armed them and supplied them.
Et je dois vous dire ici que c'est encore possible, malgré les pertes en vies humaines et en biens matériels, que, en partant du Congo, on puisse réconcilier les Congolais et les Africains.
And I would say that even despite all of the pain and the loss of life, it still is possible to think about reconciling the Congolese people and Africa more generally.
Parce que le Congolais est par nature de bon cœur, il est prompt à accorder et à demander pardon, il oublie vite et ne s'attarde jamais au passé.
That's because the Congolese have a good heart. They're very willing to forgive and very willing to open their hearts to others.
Pour lui, l'essentiel se trouve toujours dans l'avenir.
For them, the essence of the future is the future.
Parce que il aime la paix et il veut la paix pour tous les humains.
Because he loves peace and he wants peace for all humankind.
Mais aujourd'hui, ce qu'il faut, ce ne sont pas de beaux discours.
But today, what they're doing is not just nice speeches.
Ce n'est pas une spiritualité dont on a besoin.
It's not a spirituality alone that the people need.
Nous avons besoin d'actions et d'acteurs qui croient,
We need action and actors who believe,
avec un but précis, développer la personne humaine de l'Afrique en général, du Congo en particulier, développer les ressources naturelles que Dieu a placées dans ce continent.
who believe in the development of the people, of each individual, of the people as a whole, and of the resources of the country and the community.
Cela veut dire qu'il faut travailler au Congo et avec les Congolais.
That means that it's essential to work in the Congo and with the Congolese.
Il faut investir et associer le peuple africain à la production.
It's essential to invest in and to associate the African people with development.
Et je vous rassure, les potentialités regorgent dans ce pays et dans ces pays.
And I assure you that there is a rich potential that lies in this country and in this people.
Et cela pourra aider à aller vite pour guérir les cœurs blessés.
And this could make it possible to move very swiftly to heal hearts and to heal the community.
Ça demande du travail intense, c'est vrai, mais pas impossible.
It's true, it calls for very intensive effort, but it's not impossible.
Il faut donc être au Congo, il faut être en Afrique pour travailler avec les Congolais et les Africains. On pourra démarrer et on pourra apporter la paix et la réconciliation.
Thus, it's necessary to be with the Congo, with the Africans, to work for peace and to work for reconciliation.
En d'autres termes, il ne faut pas venir investir seulement au Congo, il faut venir s'investir au Congo.
That said, what's necessary is not simply to invest in the Congo, but to invest with the Congo.
Le grand avantage que nous avons, c'est notre foi, notre espérance et notre charité en Dieu.
Our greatest assets is our faith, our spirit, and our sense of love and charity.
Parce qu'un homme qui croit, qui espère et qui aime, rien n'est jamais perdu pour lui.
Because a person who loves and who hopes can never be lost.
Nous vous encourageons donc à travailler intensément ici et partout ailleurs et nous vous souhaitons la bienvenue en République démocratique du Congo. Je vous remercie.
Thus, we encourage you to work with us, and we wish you great success with this conference. And come to the Congo.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, for those framing remarks that were realistic, but at the same time uplifting and point to the future. With that, I'd like to turn it over to our first speaker, William Headley.
Thanks very much, Tom. And Marianne, I think we all owe you a special debt of thanks for doing this. And I must say, I'm really impressed with the collaborative effort that has brought us to this event tonight. I want to also acknowledge Raina Neufeld, a CRS employee until recently, who was a co-author in this paper. I also want to acknowledge my many CRS colleagues throughout the world who, in fact, their experience, their service has made these thoughts perhaps possible, however humbly and wrongly perhaps I present them. I want to say, too, I'm probably the only one in the audience this evening that was, in fact, at that conference where the bishops approved the document. It was seen as a wonderful moment at that time, and I remember it fondly as one of the great experiences of my priestly life and my life in peacebuilding. I want to say also that this has been a bit of a tour around different universities for me since I've come in from San Diego. Even though I don't appreciate your weather, I very much appreciate the environment that I'm in this evening. I was at one of these universities, and they said, "Where are you going?" And I told them where I was going. I told them I would be here tonight, and they say, "Uh-oh, that's bad. It sounds like peacebuilding has gone from the Franciscans to the Jesuits now." We begin with a story about Banda Aceh, Indonesia, a very small dot of a city in an immensely large island country. After the December 2004 tsunami, we associated with a devastating natural catastrophe and unprecedented world outpouring of generosity. A blend, if you will, into a single image of a cataclysmic event and the world extending a warm helping hand. Despite the familiarity with Indonesia's tsunami, most would be ignorant about the low-intensity war that was being played out there for 28 years when the tsunami struck. Catholic Relief Services, CRS, was one of the many international NGOs which responded to the tsunami and faced the task of bringing into harmony the strengths and challenges not only of emergency aid and development, but also peacebuilding. This presentation provides a retrospective on some of the experiences and lessons learned from CRS's efforts to engage in peacebuilding in different parts of the world. We have structured the full paper around 4 case studies: Mindanao in the Philippines, Burundi, Colombia, and Chad, Cameroon, and 7 issues that arose in pursuit of these peacebuilding initiatives between 2000 and 2007. We begin then with the briefest introduction to CRS, its history, and the evolution of Catholic social teaching and peacebuilding in its programming. We next turn, in the short time allowed, to explore 1 or 2 of the 4 cases and 2 of the 7 issues. They exemplify some of the learnings gained during the peacebuilding interventions of CRS. I'd like to offer a conclusion. It will probably be very brief. The history, then. CRS came into existence because of conflict in its early efforts were in areas more fashionably termed emergency response and post-conflict reconstruction. Towards the end of the World War II, CRS, then called the War Relief Service, and created by the predecessor of today's United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, in response to a desire to assist war-ravaged Europe. CRS grew from working with war refugees in 1943 to becoming one of the largest aid agencies in the United States, with a 2006 operating budget of nearly $600 million. As an organization, CRS has evolved. What began as a church-based effort in the 1940s became a conscientiously professional relief and development organization during the 1980s. However, the need for a new phase of evolution became evident in the 1990s. armed conflicts of various sorts, from Biafra to Afghanistan, have served as touch-teaching moments for CRS. No single war experience after World War II, however, so affected the direction of the agency as did the genocide in Rwanda. CRS had been in Rwanda for nearly 30 years, serving the relief and development aids of the people. Staff saw the ethnic tensions, knew of their origins, and simply learned to work around them. One dark day in April 1994, a modern genocide began. Before the killing stopped, more than 800,000 people were massacred. Aid and development projects of CRS were destroyed. In the post-genocide period, management and staff realized that CRS could no longer just address symptoms of conflict-stimulated crisis. It also had to attack the symptoms and structures that underlay oppression and poverty that fed conflict. Within the process of self-reflection, CRS leadership turned to Catholic resources and hidden gems. Let me mention only one of these lessons that it learned. The final product of this reflection was to take on a framework which later was called integral human development. It brought together CRS's guiding principles and programming principles alongside secular livelihood security frameworks. IHD, as we call it, assists with the conceptual integration of peacebuilding with agriculture, health, HIV/AIDS, education, and other types of developmental programs. Let me go on then and speak only of one of these instances where we have learned much. That's Mindanao. We call this particular lesson learned engaging holistically. Let me just say the briefest bit about Mindanao and the Philippines example. Mindanao is in southern Philippines. It's home of a number of long-running conflicts. The most significant is known as the Moro or Bangsamoro conflict, which centers on the pursuit of autonomy of the Marano nation and is under negotiation between that group and the government of the Republic of the Philippines. From 1996 to 2006, peacebuilding efforts focused primarily on the conflict and to a lesser degree on some of the issues that were faced by indigenous peoples there. While it is difficult to pinpoint outcomes, internal investigations suggest that there has been much progress. In the original paper, we list what those are. CRS's programming experience in Mindanao reinforces the insights that peacebuilding interventions have a greater chance of succeeding if program responses are holistic to issues, to needs, and concerns confronting partners and communities. The adaptations that were made included such things as helping people gain proactively the skills that they needed to face the conflicts in their environments. The need to work with all communities, as they did there. We also noticed they integrate income-generating activities to overcome that saying you can't talk to people with an empty stomach about peacebuilding. And finally, we found that integrating the spiritual was important too. The program has found that the partners from all communities, Islamic, traditional indigenous, Catholic, and Protestant, they find that the need to engage their spiritual depths helps their peacebuilding activities. Let me touch ever briefly on simply another example here, and that's the case of the Chad-Cameroon pipeline. We've been there since 1960. One of the things that was happening is they were transporting the oil out of the country. The whole question became one of who was going to get the money and what about the environment in that context. The Chad-Cameroon pipeline example demonstrates the solidarity in action. Networks of Catholic organizations and church bodies acted together to raise up issues to international and national organizations, and church bodies acted together in this context. This enabled voices and issues to be heard and helped with Europe, within larger corporations, within the World Bank and other global economic institutions. Another feature that the case brings to the fore is the way that Catholic social teaching and Catholic moral thought were brought to bear on different contemporary issues. Revenue sharing and oil pipelines were not issues that the Church of Cameroon and Chad, the United States Catholic Bishops' Conference, the conference in France, were not looking at those things seriously at that time. And the raising up made that possible. I don't have time for the conclusions, but just let me say in closing that we learned a great deal not only from these issues, but a number of issues. This paper, we would hope, would just be a beginning of an opportunity of looking at many, many more. Thank you for the opportunity and your patience.
Thank you for being here with us tonight. I just want to say that this is not only part of a larger series of conferences, but also part of a larger movement, the Catholic Peacebuilding Network, which seeks to bring together practitioners and theorists from around the world, folks who are working at the grassroots level in countries of conflict around the world, and to try to bring together what lessons can we learn from those to further enrich the capacity of the church around the world, as well as to further develop, as we've spoken of, a theology of peace and what that means for the church. I'm kind of the odd duck out here. I'm the political scientist among a group of theologians, and they've asked me to speak about the emerging institutions, because norms don't just exist in our heads. For them to really be practical, to take root, to affect social and political change, they have to exist in organizations and institutions. So that's the reason I've been asked to look at that. And there's some good news and bad news to report here. The good news is that we are seeing a real emergence of new peace-building institutions, that peace-building is a growth industry around the world. There have been new institutions emerging at the United Nations Peacebuilding Commission. New institutions within the U.S. government. The Department of State has started up an Office of Post-Conflict Reconstruction and Stabilization. And in really big terms, for those of you who followed the debate within the U.S. military in the 90s over humanitarian intervention and other things, where there was a resolute group in the military against doing so-called nation building, that has changed. That's now been a new directive of the Secretary of Defense that post-conflict reconstruction and stability operations are a core mission of the U.S. military, on accord with their traditional warfighting components. So that's a real sea change to try to settle those debates. And that's the good news. The good news is increased attention to the importance of peace building and an increased attention to try to build new institutions and institutional capacities. My paper focuses on the UN and the US institutions, but the same could be said internationally. There have been dozens of new peace-building institutions and units set up within governments and intergovernmental agencies around the world to try to build more capacity and devote greater attention to sustainable peace and to building peace in the long term. And this is not an accident. This is happening because of a series of failures. At the United Nations, there was a great deal of optimism after the end of the Cold War that the United Nations would be more effective in being able to build peace. And they found that there were many instances where some of the worst conflicts that erupted, as Bill mentioned, genocide in Rwanda after 1994, erupted after a UN-mediated peace settlement. So that led to a lot of internal soul searching, not only in CRS, but at the United Nations, that we really have a very limited menu of tools, a very limited capacity to build peace, and we're looking at a small slice of the pie, at negotiating solutions, negotiating settlements with elites, and not at the more grassroots level and a more sustainable level. So Kofi Annan suggested that we create this new UN Peacebuilding Commission so that the UN would have more capacity and capacity to do more sustainable peace, building more sustainable peace. There was also concern that some of the statistics showed no difference in a country's being able to sustain peace, whether there was a UN presence or not. And 50% of countries reemerged into conflict within 5 years. So some very sobering statistics that led to folks at the UN saying we need to do better, we need to build institutional capacity. At the Department of State and Department of Defense, the failures are more readily known to us Americans in terms of the failures in post-conflict reconstruction in Iraq and Afghanistan. And that led to movement by both the President and the Secretary of Defense to say we have to do better in this capacity and we have to build capacity. So that's the good news. The failures have led to an openness and an attention to peace building that wasn't there before. The bad news is that capacity gaps still exist, that these new institutions don't have a great deal of organizational resources available to make good on these missions they've been given. And as Washingtonians, we tend to be a little bit cynical, and one way to measure how serious you are about new institutions is to follow the money trail. And that's a very short trail in this case to follow. All of these institutions were created without new funding sources. So the UN Peacebuilding Commission was founded with only a voluntary fund that countries may contribute to. It's a very modest fund to sustain the work of the commission. The Department of State was not funded, this new unit within the Department of State. So that put them on very precarious footing from the beginning to try to rob resources from other units within the organization to pay for them. Now, you might wonder, how is it possible that the Department of Defense, with an $800 billion budget, is finding a funding difficulty? But remember that these two new directives at both at State and at Defense did not originate from Congress. And in the United States constitutional system, for anything to be funded, there has to be a directive from Congress. So the President can say this ought to be done, or the Secretary of Defense could say this ought to be done, but unless money is authorized from Congress, there's no new money available. So there's not the traditional organizational means to actually turn these initiatives into reality. So it is true that it's a big change from the past. It is true that it's an important trend to note for the future, but they also have very precarious institutional footing, and these could change with the elections in November here in the United States and with new administration in the United Nations. So stay tuned. It's too early to declare them failures. It's too early to declare them successes, but the road forward is still unclear in terms of whether they will have the resources to be able to make good on their missions. That's the capacity gap. There's other gaps that we're concerned about, and that's the work of the Catholic Peacebuilding Network, and that's the normative gaps. What is the type of peace that these organizations are seeking? And you see a real diversity along a continuum from the Department of Defense, which is a much more short-term focus on security and stabilization, and as their mission statement says, pursuing order and post-conflict reconstruction in as far as it advances U.S. interests. That's right in their mission statement. So that's a very clear statement of where they're coming from, a rather narrow slice of the spectrum. And the Department of State as well has a more short-term focus, and that leads to not only a normative focus that is more focused on the state and the interests of the state, but also to particular practices. Those norms play out into policy. So policy tends to be very state-centric, looking at working with elites, building the structures of governance, and also to very physical reconstruction efforts, building roads, building bridges. The epitome of this is a book by a U.S. Army colonel called Engineering Peace, in which the suggestion is if we just get the Army Corps of Engineers in on this from the beginning, we'll build the best roads and bridges possible, and peace building really is a construction process about building physical infrastructure, and that's all you have to worry about. So that's kind of one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum is the Catholic approach, as enunciated by Bill Headley at CRS and Caritas International, where fundamental to the effort is the fundamental dignity of the human person and protection of human life. And from that, you look at the common good, you look at solidarity, subsidiarity, other elements of Catholic social teaching. But the human person is front and center. And the UN Commission, UN Peacebuilding Commission, falls somewhere in between. There's obviously attention to human rights, attention to the human person, but they are still very much the creature of states and are at the in some ways are very constrained by the interests of the states that make up the United Nations. And that difference, the importance of state sovereignty, is really an important normative dividing point for these institutions. Because for the Catholic Church, we've existed for 16 centuries before there was a sovereign state system. Then we existed for a while as a sovereign state, and now several centuries with a sovereign state system. So we have a very different and more nuanced view of sovereignty than these other institutional entities. For the Catholic Church, the purpose of the sovereign state is to protect human life and the human person. And we're happy to work with states that do that, but for states that are not able to protect or defend human life, the Catholic Church does not sit back and wait till state institutions are in place to be able to do their work, as you've seen from some of the examples Bill gave of CRS. So if you're looking for an NGO example or metaphor, we're more like Doctors Without Borders that are going to go in wherever there's human suffering and human need, regardless of whether state structures are in place, than the International Committee of the Red Cross that waits for permission from governments before going in to do their business. So for the Catholic Church, the state exists to serve the human person and not the other way around. And that leads to very different positions on peace building. The good news here, though, is these normative discrepancies are a moment of opportunity for the Church. The Church historically and in coalition with other religious groups and coalition with civil society have a very good track record of moving institutional development and changing international norms. What we think of as norms, as voluntary, as ideas, soft law, over time becomes hard law. And we really have historic opportunities now to influence the political process now more than ever before. Why is that so? Because in an information age, ideas matter, and we've got them. We've got important ideas, and we've got institutional capacity to get those ideas out there. So from debt relief to the abolition movement to the campaign to end poverty, AIDS relief in Africa, we have a very proven track record of being able to change the political debate and change institutional structures in ways I think we need to pay attention to, and that's our task before us now. The final part of my paper I won't be able to discuss with you tonight, but I encourage you to look at the website, the Catholic Peacebuilding Network website. All of these papers will be posted. And there I suggest some criteria for just peace criteria that can be the third component of just war tradition. And again, point out the way that if you start from the fundamental importance of human life and human rights at the centerpiece, you end up with different moral criteria for just peace than you do if you approach it from another position. But I thank you for your time and your patience with us tonight, and I look forward to having a further discussion.
As the title of my lecture indicates, there are three things I'd like to do, two things in particular. The first thing is the Catholic teaching on interreligious dialogue, what it is, and how is it done. And secondly, I'd like to look at some attempts by Catholics to collaborate with other religions in order to produce peace and reconciliation. And the third part is to develop a Catholic spirituality for peace building and reconciliation in the context of interreligious dialogue. Before I do so, I'd like to introduce one book. I don't know whether the author is here. Maybe it's Tom Brammer. Is that you? Somebody is here, supposed to be here.
From Catholic Relief Services, I don't know if
No, it's not here. Yeah, I see his name.
I'll tell them that you said nice words about
Right.
it.
So this book is called Artisans of Peace. In case you don't know what to buy for your wife or husband or children for Christmas and New Year and Thanksgiving, this is the book you like to buy. Because it is a wonderful account of how Catholic social teachings function on the grassroots. The second is an article by a very, 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 very famous author, Peacemaking and Reconciliation, Roman Catholic Teachings in the Context of Interreligious Dialogue. I just picked it up on the way out of my office, volume 16, number 2, Journal for Peace and Justice Studies. So it's a wonderful article. If you want to know anything about that, just the old article you need to read. The author shall remain anonymous. I am kidding. First of all, I am talking about, very briefly, keep my time, okay? I am talking about the theology of interreligious dialogue. In that first section, I spent a lot of time on John Paul II. I begin with Vatican II, Nostra Aetate, and Lumen Gentium, but the focus on John Paul II, because in him you find the development of what Vatican II teaches about religions and interreligious dialogue. There's no doubt that John Paul II of all popes is the foremost exponent, practitioner of interreligious dialogue. I'd like to pick out a few examples of his life. In order to understand John Paul's theology of dialogue, look at his symbolic gestures. Do not look so much at the text, because his symbolic gestures far outstrip what he wants to say. Sometimes you wonder whether he really fully cognizant of all the theological implications of his actions. The first action is the invitation to all religious leaders of all religions to come to Assisi in 1986, October, to pray for peace. Not only Catholics, but also non-Catholic Christians and, my God, non-Christians, religious leaders. When he proposed this initiative, immediately there was a great reaction, of course, negative reactions among his advisors, whose name, again, shall remain unmentioned. The danger is that it is religious syncretism. How could have all people come and pray together? But John Paul II pushed forward nonetheless. And at the Assisi meeting, he paid attention to the criticism or the warning of religious syncretism by having religious leaders go to different places with their religious followers and pray in their own religious tradition, then come back to the piazza of the basilica, and then each one of them say their prayers in their tradition. Okay? This is what is said to be together to pray. The religious leaders come together to pray. They did not come to pray together. This is a radical distinction. It's a slogan, but becomes so important for those who are afraid of religious syncretism. They did not pray together. They were together to pray serially, each in its own religious tradition. But nevertheless, it is a step forward. The second step forward is his dialogue with Jews. Perhaps the person who has done most for the Jews. You know that his family lived in Krakow, near Krakow, in a house rent from Jews. That's why he knew them. And his closest friends from high school onwards were Jews. So from that, and his was the experience of Holocaust, I mean, that brought him into. And he was the first pope to go into a synagogue. I mean, the Jewish synagogue, Trastevere, is about 10 minutes walk across the, but for 2,000 years, no pope ever stepped inside that. And he was the first to come, and he said, I come not just to be nice to you, I come to pray with you. And this is very radical. He doesn't come there to say his Christian prayers. He said that to pray with Jews. And that is certainly symbolic of what theology. And the third is that his relationship with Muslims, particularly his address to the youth in Morocco. And there he maintained that Muslims and Christians worship the same God. Again, the clear affirmation of the commonality between. So those are the gestures that bring about his theology of interreligious dialogue. I don't want to talk too many about it, but there's one thing. If there's anything that John Paul II has contributed to the theology of interreligious dialogue, is his theology of the Holy Spirit, the pneumatology of religious dialogue. He maintained that the Holy Spirit is present not only in individual hearts, that's nothing new, but the Holy Spirit functions, is operative in all peoples, in their cultures, in their religions, social institutions. He did not go so far to say that these religions are ways of salvation. He never said that. But when you take these out, the consequence of what he said, namely, these religions are not human works, are not human inventions, but the Holy Spirit, then you just next the question, can you say somehow that these religions also lead them through the Holy Spirit? So therefore, not only the specificity, the particularity of Jesus, but also the universality of the actions of the Holy Spirit. So that's, I think this is a wonderful contribution to the theology of interreligious dialogue. The second part, quickly, is I study three cases, one of which already mentioned by Bill, namely the Catholics' work in Mindanao with the Muslims, Islam. The second case I'm studying is Sri Lanka, where Catholic and Buddhism are working together. And the third is in Indonesia, particularly the contribution of the Bishop of East Timor towards reconciliation and so forth. But I wouldn't bother you with that. I'd like to end with the third part, namely the spirituality. A Catholic spirituality for peace building in the context of interreligious dialogue. The first thing I like to say is this. Central to that spirituality is the question, who is God for people who walk in this, or not God at all. It's very interesting that most people can walk there and never raise the question of God. You know, that raises the questions of human dignity, human worth, the questions of human rights. This is what unites them. The motivation is not I believe in God. The motivation is that we do believe in human dignity, that there's something wrong when a group of people are marginalized, oppressed, and so forth. But behind that is image of God as Christians, as Catholics. And often there are three images of God lie behind it. The first image, God as a power over. God as creator, God as the master, God as the one who can redress the injustices in the world. The second image, God as the actor, the one who can really transform life, who wants to transform social injustice situations, who want to bring peace. And third image, God as immanent, God as present in the faces of all people, whether believers, unbelievers, and so forth. So that is the kind of theology, image of God, that lies behind this fundamental theology, spirituality. The second element is the questions of remembering, memory. There can be no spirituality of reconciliation and peace building without healing of memory. And this implies three things. First, remember truthfully, to know exactly what has happened, who did it to whom, who is the one responsible. Very often we deny our responsibility. But the first thing is to discover what really happened, because the first victim of war and injustice is truth. The second, remember justly, to restore justice. Not simply to know who is responsible, but also to restore justice, that the perpetrator be punished, punitive justice. But more than that is the restorative justice, the damage is done, and the reconstructive justice, so that justice structures are put in a situation so that no future danger or risk of injustice be avoided. And thirdly, and this is something that has not happened, this is something we have to work with, and that is a Catholic spirituality developed from below. And this Catholic spirituality can be developed only in the context of living together, working together, discussing together, and above all, praying together. Without people of diverse groups, enemies, and so forth, coming to pray together, no peace can be achieved, or at least lasting. And this is something that is a great challenge for us. And then we need how to bring our spirituality of peace building and reconciliation in connection with for example, the Jewish theology of shalom, the Muslim theology of submission to God's will, the Hindu tradition of nonviolence, the Buddhist tradition of compassion, the Jainist tradition of nonviolence, not hurting life, the Confucian tradition of universal harmony, and a Taoist tradition of the way, the cosmos. I think this is something that begins to emerge. I haven't seen any books that begin talking about this, because very often we start only from above, that we have certain principles. But emerging from out together, I think this is a kind of challenge for the Catholic spirituality for peace and justice in the future. Thank you.
So thanks to Thomas and Marianne. Thanks to all of you for giving me the opportunity to share some insights with you on peace building in Africa and in Congo. And I will say a few words on peace building in Africa, and then I will take the case study of my country, Congo. So when you have a look on the situation on Africa today, you will see that there are many tensions and conflicts in many parts of Africa, in the north, south, central, and the east. So to name some countries who are going through tensions, you have Uganda, Chad, Congo, Kinshasa, Central Africa, Ethiopia, Burundi, Rwanda, Somalia, Zimbabwe, Angola, Ivory Coast, Congo-Brazzaville. And intervention into these conflicts will not yield the expected effects if the root causes of the conflicts are not correctly defined and well understood. Thus, a deeper understanding of the historical, political, cultural, social, economical key factors will be a first step to address the issue of conflict resolution in Africa. And we know that there are 4 main causes of conflict in Africa. You have the lack of rule of law, impunity, lack of political governance, and lack of economic governance through mismanagement of public funds and a systematic looting of natural resources. And all the conflicts in the continent have national, regional, and international implications. You can't solve a very local problem within Africa, even in a town, in a village, without seeing the regional, the international, let's say, implications. So one cannot establish sustainable peace in Eastern Congo, for example, without regional and international collaboration. And to say a word on the link between the conflicts and the natural resources, it's one of the main causes of the conflicts in the continent, the one on the exploitation of mineral resources. And mainly in DRC, you have coltan, diamond, copper, cobalt, and gold. And this has been reported in the UN report of 2002, and also the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1457. And in Congo, our parliament, what we used to be called the Transitional Parliament, Lutundula report, you have all this that have clearly shown a clear and direct link between the illegal exploitation of natural resources and the war and violence going on even today. And what about the human cost? I just give you figures. We have up to now 5.4 million people have been reported, have died throughout the conflict since 1998. And this has been reported by International Rescue Committee. It was very recent, it was 20th of January of this year during the Goma Peace Conference. We have 1.5 million IDPs throughout the country, of whom half of those are children and women. We have 1.5 million people who are infected by HIV/AIDS, and it is 4.5% of the total population of Congo. 40,000 cases of rape, weapon of war, and sexual violence against women and girls. And I think for those who attended the Congo Global Action Conference, one of the speakers, Dr. Mukwege, was explaining to us that it's a very special way of doing rape. It's not the traditional rape that you know here in the States. When you are destroying life from a girl or a woman, it's really the future generation that we are destroying. Because that girl or that woman, she's supposed to give birth tomorrow to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 kids, and those will be continuing giving, let's say, perpetuating the generation. And so we are killing or destroying life from women. I think you are destroying the whole, let's say, population. You have also 40,000 million Congolese who suffer from malnutrition. So when you have this setting and this broad picture, what kind of peace building do we need? And here I will rely on CRS definition of peace building. It must be rooted in social Catholic teaching. And it's a process. Peace building is a process. It's not a fact. It's more a phenomenon and a process that aims to, first, to change unjust structures, B, to transform the way people live, C, to heal their relationships, and to create a space for mutual trust, respect, and interdependence. And from that definition, you have some peace-building principles. Peace-building should be a response to the root causes of the conflict. And when you don't look to the root causes, what we are doing is really superficial. You can't go deeper and come up with something sustainable. Peace-building is a long-term commitment. It's not that, okay, we are solving a problem today, and after a month, that's okay. You have to go through it after years and years and bear fruit. It involved in-depth participatory analysis of the conflict. That means all the people who are involved in the conflict should participate and bring their own stone for the edification of peace building. It has to have a focus on the community, defined visions and needs. It's not from outside. If you want to do peace building, you have to go in, listen to people, try to get their vision and needs, and then try to respond to those. Otherwise, you are coming from outside with your own vision and imposing it on the people. Peace building should be an integration of all the people sharing common values. And I'm happy that Father Hedley and Marianne and Peter Pan come up on the values. You have to base this to be rooted in values: human dignity, justice, option for the poor, solidarity, reconciliation, and so on. And the last principle is advocacy. Whenever people are doing peace building, somehow they're involved in advocacy, and at different levels. You have advocacy at the local level, advocacy at the national level in the country, advocacy in the regional level, and advocacy on the continent, and at the global level, at the international level. Peace building and the Goma conference. So here I'm just giving, let's say, affirming some things that I believe in. Peace building cannot be built when basic needs are not fulfilled. And that's the case in my country. Do not talk about peace on empty stomach. No one will listen to you. And you can't reconcile people. You can't bring them for peace building. No peace building without addressing the problem of security and development. As you have seen, the picture is very, let's say, bad. So you need to link peace, security, and development. This is why the peace conference in Goma was a conference on peace, security, and development. And I think if you don't bring them together, you can't go very far. So you have to have a correct analysis and understanding of the root causes of the conflict, and you have to enable people to articulate their vision and implement the plans for establishing peace and development. So 2 quotations to end with the Catholic bishop in Congo. They have done a lot in peace building, and at the last meeting in Goma, they came up with a memorandum, and I just give you 2 quotations and with a conclusion. They said this in their memorandum of January 20th of this year. Peace is not the absence of war, nor the equilibrium of opposite forces. The church vision of peace touches deeper dimensions such as love, forgiveness, reconciliation, justice, and charity. Such a vision of peace is founded on a correct conception of the dignity of human person and is inspired by Christian faith, social Catholic teaching, biblical and encyclical teaching. The vision that the church has about peace is therefore inspired by peace that Christ left to his disciples. And the second quotation, the church, that means the church in Congo, is committed to pursue her mission of reconciliation and reconstruction, because for the church, there is no peace without forgiveness and reconciliation. But they said it's not easy to forgive in the midst of a large-scale disaster caused by war. What is the conclusion? I don't think, I'm a philosopher, I'm teaching philosophy at the Jesuit faculty in Kinshasa. And here it's not a matter of thinking, it's a matter of believing and being convinced of. Today, a sustainable peace building requires a rule of law, political governance, people participation, sustainable development, and democracy. And what is needed when I analyze the situation in the Great Lake region, in Congo, or in many parts, many countries in Africa, we need more a spirituality of peace than a theology of peace. By spirituality of peace, I mean we need people in peace, not in pieces, in peace, living really that serenity within themselves. And so that they may be able to work and to promote peace. In fact, you can't give what you don't have. So what we are supposed to give, we are giving what you are and what you have. So if we are ourselves in peace, at peace, and then we can be makers of peace for others. So I end there. Thank you.
Well, this is a fascinating menu of both individual cases and provocative ideas and thought. I thought it would be useful to step back a little into another world, which is the way that secular institutions might approach or do approach some of these issues of conflict, reconciliation, etc. And here I think that there is, until recently, until really quite recently, in most of the major development institutions involved in post-conflict, there's been virtually no institutional relationship with faith institutions, whether interfaith or individual faith, including the Catholic Church. In fact, if you look at most of what's been written about post-conflict, you will not find very much about religion. And let's go a step further and be frank. There really is a very healthy skepticism about interreligious dialogue. The eyes glaze over when you talk about dialogue, which is viewed as an opposite to effective action. Relatively limited knowledge about the kind of work that many faith institutions have done, and a predominant view that religion is really a source of conflict, a cause of conflict, rather than a solution. So there is a challenge, particularly since so many of the actors who are at the peace table, and above all, who are mobilizing the resources and looking at the institutions that will take shape in the world's hotspots, that this disconnect between the language and the world of religion and the language and the world of the secular institutions involved is very large. What we're seeing, there's been an interesting study by CSIS that a number of us have been involved in that has, its title is Mixed Blessings, and there have been a number of others that at least have opened the door. But they're still, you sort of say, well, you know, they say, well, religion is the problem. Let's not have anything to do with it. You say, well, and I say, well, what about Martin Luther King, or what about Gandhi, or, you know, a few others? And they say, oh, yeah, but are you sure they're really religious? So I think that it is useful to recognize that there's an uphill battle. And there is, I think, a growing awareness. I've had a number of meetings at the World Bank just within the last couple of months about really thinking about the role of religion in post-conflict. And I would say there's a healthy curiosity and interest, but there is also, well, you know, what does it mean? I mean, what do I do next? What does that mean? I mean, because one of the answers, we're not going to just send the money that way. Surely that's not what anyone wants anyway. But I think that in this context, one thing that's very important are effective case studies. And it is difficult. It's more difficult than it sounds, because perhaps even more in conflict situations than in anything else, each story is so fundamentally different, and trying to draw any kind of threads that link different situations, Angola to Timor-Leste to Congo to Somalia to Afghanistan, is really very difficult. So I think that there is a door that's opening. There's a tremendous need, but there's quite a set of challenges that are really worth thinking about as to where to go next. Next comment that I wanted to make briefly is in the development world, I think there's a major paradigm shift that is perhaps encapsulated best in Paul Collier's book, The Bottom Billion. And to put it in, to crib from a public health specialist, Hans Rosling, as he says, you know, my neighbor, he said, knows everything about wine. He knows 200 different kinds of wine. He knows every grape, every vintage, etc. He said, I know 2 kinds of wine, red and white. However, my neighbor, he said, knows 2 kinds of countries, developing countries and developed countries, but I know 200 kinds of countries. I mean, the classic images that fit countries into baskets is irrelevant, really, in today's complex, multipolar tapestry or kaleidoscope of countries. But there is a trend that's sort of emerging from this globalized pattern, which is that there are one set of countries, and in some definitions it's 1 billion people in them, about 57 countries. By others it's about 28. There are various definitions. You know, where does Nigeria fit? I think it's fairly clear where Congo fits. But there is a lot of rethinking, but the idea is that these countries, it's even more difficult for them to get on the ladder than it was for the previous generation, that they need a tremendously sharp focus. And they are, of course, very closely tied to the problems of terrorism, in the sense that they are the worst governed, they're havens, and it is very much a vicious circle or a vicious cycle. Now, in that sense, I have tremendous admiration for Paul Collier, and I strongly recommend his book. But if you go to the index, religion's not there. He has not dealt at all. So I think that forcing an engagement of a dialogue about what the implications are of this group of countries, and I'll mention in passing that a very disproportionate number of these countries are Muslim, of the populations that are involved. Upwards of 50, probably 60% of people who fall into these categories are Muslim, which means that you need to think and have knowledge of what that means in cultural terms in order to act. Given the time constraints, I'll only mention one other area that I think is, again, a sort of shifting paradigm. For a long time, conflict situations were dealt with in sort of a variety of cycles. You had bubbling pre-conflict, sort of something's about to happen, something bad, I guess. I don't know whether Zimbabwe is in perpetual pre-conflict. Then you have the conflict. Then you have the negotiation. Then you have the post-conflict, which is a sort of series of very specific measures. Certain UN agencies have responsibilities, and sort of reconciliation going on. And then you move basically back into development. That was sort of the image on which people worked. And it's not insignificant because it framed people's thinking, but it also framed the way institutions operated, including some of the faith institutions, which were involved at different stages, whether they were at the negotiating table or particularly which were very much involved in the post-conflict situation, though perhaps much too much in an instrumental sense. But the reality of recent years is that this nice, smooth pattern of emerging conflict, peacemaking, peace post-conflict, and then peace building, building the just peace, has broken down. And what you're seeing is very complex patterns where, for example, in one country where an example the people have given that I think is important in Congo is that there are every situation going on in the same country. In other words, it's a very complex pattern. I will end with just a comment that I want to reinforce what has been said, starting with the Archbishop, but with a number of others, that there is, I think, a very strong case to be made that without development, without hope, and without the prospect of better lives, you will see a continuation, particularly given the peculiar facets of the bottom billion, in other words, of the countries that are stuck at the bottom. So the question of how do you get the hope and the development going is critical. And there are 2 comments that I would make there. The first is that there needs to be a much better dialogue about what it takes to get development going, including the economic policies, the social policies, et cetera, the role of women, all of the other issues that are very much on the table, but where I think the dialogue is very poor. And the second is that in today's world, I think we realize that it isn't just feeding people. It isn't just starvation that is what people are talking about when they're talking about poverty. It is about social justice. And the language there is equity. It's some sense of fairness, some sense of balance that needs to come into the restructuring of societies. And without that focus, that positive focus, it's very hard to visualize how we will be able to move forward.
25 years ago, we had the Catholic Bishops' Peace Pastoral here in the United States, and look how very different times are. If you think back about how this country goes to war and the Catholic community involved in that, it's very different than it was even in comparison with the Vietnam era. For so long, Catholics were trying to prove their loyalty here in the United States, and so we always went along with the direction the government was going. But suddenly, you know, this new voice began to be heard, questioning, is this the right thing to do? Is this the just thing to do? Before the Peace Pastoral, Catholics really had very little opportunity to talk about selective conscientious objection and the justice of a war, and nowadays they do more and more in this country. So you can see that a lot has happened in the last 25 years. A lot more than, if you listen to what the speakers have been telling us, a lot more indeed. In fact, Bill Headley took us through about 3 stages of Catholic relief services, from the typical relief agency meeting the needs in a post-war situation, refugees and so forth, to realizing that it needed to become a truly professional organization and to make itself as professional as secular institutions. And then again, after a certain point, realizing that's not enough itself, we have to talk about human development, integral human development. And I think you could find this in a lot of the initiatives of that period of the Second Vatican Council 45 years ago, that certain stages we've passed through, that at one point we needed to sort of get the news out among ourselves and to get busy with things, but and at some point we had to stop and think, well, is this the way to keep doing it? Do we need to change the model? Do we need to rethink our involvement in it? Now, the big difference as we are at this edge, and it's not only true of peace work and development work and interreligious work, as Peter brought up, and we could even talk about ecumenical work, a lot of the initiatives that make us who we are as a Catholic Church today after 45 years. But the situation's very different. For the first 40 years, we depended on religious orders and diocesan priests to do a lot of this work, and a lot of cheap labor, more and more laity involved in it. Well, now we're in a very different situation, and we see, you know, the good news and the bad news, as Marianne was telling us. We have these institutions out there that are developed, but the bad news is this gap in capacity. Well, who's going to fill that gap? So we have to figure out a way to make what we truly believe in work, really work. It's good to have someone like John Paul II, as Peter emphasized. I've often given the same kind of talk. Without him, interreligious dialogue would have died on the vine. And it's these bold gestures that sort of blew the imagination for all of us, you know, to gather people together in Assisi for prayer. And I was in many of those. I'm pinching myself, am I really hearing this, when things would happen, when a Muslim leader who led the organization, Muslim World League, for propagating Islam throughout the world, thanks the Pope for what he's doing, what he did during the 1991 Gulf War and conflict. And I'm saying, this guy's thanking the Pope? You know, I never thought I would see that. But so he got it out there, and he showed, you know, this is really important, and look at the spiritual dimension, and that's what makes it exciting when we connect as people on this level. Well, eventually people start doing that themselves. And so that's where we are right now. Interreligious dialogue has moved down to a popular level. In many ways, people's spiritual practice is becoming more and more integrated as far as various religious traditions go. And peace building is becoming more and more an on-the-ground activity. But how is this going to move? Where are we going to find the resources? And of course, speaking of resources, we're told that none of this works without development, without meeting the needs that people have. So you got all kinds of financial needs here. You've got institutional needs, and you've got human power needs. And then listening to both the Archbishop and Father Ferdinand, we realize, well, in a generation, and maybe it'll take longer, 100 years, people will look back and say, look how horrible the 21st century was. Every problem in the world was telescoped in Africa. Why? Why did Africa seem to have all the problems of humanity? And why were they there in their worst possible condition? And who caused that, and who allowed it to go on? And you have reminded us of the commitment that the rest of the world really should have to Africa, and the great diversity. It's not one size fits all. We've got a diversity of problems and a diversity of challenges, but tremendous hope. I mean, you read the statement, Father Ferdinand, that came out of the bishops of the Congo as recent as January, and you read this hope that comes from their very, very bottom ground of their spiritual life and practice. And there's great hope that there's something that can be done here. And we hear these themes again. No peace without justice, no justice without forgiveness. We hear these themes, and we got to make these real. But at the same time, I think we're confronted with these very huge problems. Take this where we are right now in the American political debate. I'm reminded very personally of what's going on. We're all debating whether or not we should get out of Iraq. Now, I've been there before because in 1970, I was in Vietnam. And not that I wasn't looking for things to do, I was pretty busy keeping track of what every prisoner of war and every deserter was telling us in the 5 northern provinces of South Vietnam. That was my job. I did a few of those interrogations myself, but I was collecting this and making the colonel look good in front of the general. And at night, though, I volunteered to teach English to young people who wanted to go into science because they had a hope that American presence would allow them to have a life. But it was hanging by the fragile thread of the American Air Force and our troop power, and we were talking the same language we're talking now. So and I was very much against the war. I felt like we didn't belong there to begin with, as I was very much against the Iraq war. But here we are involved. If we pull out, there's all kinds of, as Jerry Powers has written about in America, and I cited with Marianne when she gave the paper earlier a week, or a version of the paper, there's this ethics of withdrawal we've got to think about. And yet this is not going to play out in an American political arena. You know, as we talk about, we are the causes of much of the devastation, all the devastation that's been going on, and the unleashing of forces in Iraq. How are we going to build peace if we withdraw when our very presence there is attracting violence too? What's the ethics of withdrawal and so forth? And I just remember I very much felt like we did not need to lose more American life in Vietnam, and that finally we were being listened to. But at the same time, all those people I taught English to, their future went away. And Vietnam remained quite undeveloped for a very long time. So I'm reminded again, and then I'm brought back to Africa, to the people that are trying to find a glimmer of hope. And it's on this level of our faith, of coming, as Peter said, this fourth level, really identifying with what the gospel is about. You identify that God is with you there suffering in this moment. That's our message. And I think in that and in all the diversity that we face, we can begin to kind of build along with you the kinds of hopes that you are offering us as you come and speak to us from Africa. But we face enormous challenges, switching our institutions into a new gear for the future, our church taking on new forms, the church itself, that's one of your subheadings, right, Marianne? The church has got to change. Not that we ever heard that before, but the church, we have to find a way that we're going to do the same things we've been doing and even more with fewer resources available to us cheaply through religious orders. And we're going to have to, I believe, find a way to present what we are committed to, as we have been in the last 40 years, and in some way make that a vision that young people also want to take up. So, thank you.
Thank you, John, and thank you to all of our panelists for a very wide-ranging discussion. We covered a lot of ground in a short amount of time, really. Short enough so that we have some time for questions, about 10 minutes, to touch on particular issues that have been raised, the political, a lot on the economic and the social dimension, and then I thought, surprisingly but also appropriately, much on the spiritual foundations of peace-building work. So if you have a question, I'd ask you to stand up, briefly introduce yourself, pose a question of one of the panelists or perhaps a respondent if you are provoked by a respondent. And then I'd ask colleagues from the panel to come up here to the microphone because the acoustics here are not very good. So we have a question here and then here. Yes.
I'm Stephen Kalecki with the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. I direct the international office there. And my question is around capacity building. And it's really both for Marianne and for Father Headley, for both of you, I think. There's capacity building of the church for peace building, which has been much of the mission of Catholic Relief Services in its local partnerships. So I have, the question there is like, what are the essential ingredients of that kind of capacity building of a local church for peace? In terms of how do you engage the church? I mean, at what levels does one enter in? And that relates to a very different capacity building question that actually I'm very worried about as the U.S. tries to build capacity for peace building. And we've had a preliminary conversation about this. But as both the State Department and the Department of Defense seek capacity building for peace building, it seems to me that at least that may blur some lines, particularly as the Defense Department develops that capacity, and especially if it's very short-term thinking rather than long-term development, if it's not connected well to civil society and NGOs on the ground. And so I'm wondering if you could comment about that, sort of the pitfalls of that capacity building, or the potential pitfalls of that.
Thank you, Steve, and good to be with you again, certainly. I'll address the question about sort of what does it take on the ground somewhat. I think it's kind of a dance, if you will. There needs to be people like Father Frederick, who on the ground sense this and feel that they have the potential for doing something. I think at some point, though, that they need to have the hierarchy kind of enter into this effort. And I say that from CRS's experience. For many years, it prided itself at working at the grassroots, and it did a very good job at that many times. But time and time again, it would grow limp because it did not have the sense of support from the top. Same token, if you just talk to the bishops and there's no one else to do it, that's not so good. I would say a third element that occurs to me right away, I'm sure there'd be more if I had more time to think about it, is that we need to touch down on the methodologies that are available in the societies themselves. With all due respect to the sort of modalities that Marianne speaks to, I think there are opportunities in the community, and perhaps the best example is Burundi and Rwanda, where they have the Gacaca methodology. We need to kind of do this. But also, we need to, with gentleness, bring new methodologies to bear on this and show the compatibility of that with our theology.
In the paper, I address this, and there are some concerning institutional developments. Basically, in the absence of building a civilian capacity to build peace, the Department of Defense in the United States has been taking on more of these functions. And on the one hand, you could say, well, that's a good thing. If folks are going to be tasked with doing this anyway, shouldn't they be thinking about it? Shouldn't they be trained in it, et cetera? And that certainly is true. But the other argument can be made as well. If the Department of Defense is the lead agency in practice, because they're the only ones who have the resources to do this, and their focus is quite upfront, that it's going to be on, first of all, security and order, and who are they going to partner with in societies when they go to? How do they see that mission of building peace? Well, they first see it about building the security apparatus of the state. So we see a movement in Congress right now by the Department of Defense trying to get more congressional authorization to not only train foreign militaries, but train foreign security forces, police forces, intelligence forces that are often big abusers of human rights and may not be advocates of building civil society within their countries. But in the name of first concerning yourself with the war on terror and building security forces, if that's your agenda, that's the way you're going to go. That's a very different kind of capacity than if this was in the hands of civilians. If foreign aid goes through the Department of State, there are restrictions on human rights, on oversight, on transparency, even within our own government. So many of the movements legally right now and legislatively right now are to remove restrictions, remove transparency, give greater flexibility in the name of we need more flexibility in fighting the war on terror, which translates to we won't even know what our own military is doing as well as what private military forces and contractors are doing. So it's some very troubling developments. And again, it goes to what kind of peace do you seek and what kind of institutions are you going to build to that? And if we don't, advocate and highlight this issue, and this in the paper I also talk about, there's a bit of a disconnect between relief and development agencies of the Catholic Church and our advocacy arms of the Catholic Church, that while they may be advocating for peace building in specific arenas, Sudan, Somalia, have not really entered into this debate much on the capacity building of institutions. But if we don't do this, if we don't build the capacity of civilian institutions, it is being built elsewhere and in ways that could be very disadvantageous to people around the world who suffer human rights, who suffer in conflict, and to the Church around the world.
Thank you. One more question right here. Mm-hmm.
Thanks. I'm sorry for my English. It's not very good, but I'll try. I am Edouard Kusala. I am the Secretary General of IYCS, International Young Catholic Students based in Paris. Okay. About conflicts, one of the second victim of conflicts is young people nowadays. And we can see easily how they are using during those conflicts to do for the war. And it's become like only their inherent is conflicts. As how one speaker said, no one can give what he can't. And young people are the future of the future of our society. So if the peace building programs and the social teaching of the church can think about the education to give to young people, to bring them, to make them a new leader for tomorrow, for the future of for our countries, I think that we can have a very nice result and sustainable peace in the future for our countries. That's only what I want to say.
Would any of the panelists like to speak to the issue of young people? Why don't we take one more question? Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. My name is Bradley Jenkins. I'm doing a year of service here in DC. But I just had a question for Dr. Usimano Love. You identified a normative gap, and I actually believe, especially concerning the kind of Department of Defense methodology and generally the American political debate, if you ask most people, and unfortunately most of your colleagues in political theory, even what a Catholic approach to Iraq and Afghanistan is, it's going to track very nicely onto a just war methodology. The Department of Defense is talking about minimizing proportionality, and minimizing the effects of war. And unfortunately, this is also a Catholic heritage. And so how do we mobilize around a just peace even within a Catholic context, while in other words, subordinating the idea of just war to the idea of first analysis of just peace or peace building.
The third part of the paper that I didn't have time to talk about really addresses this, and there's been very little attention given to developing this third leg of just war tradition. Just war tradition has always implied the necessity of a just peace discussion, but that's been the least attended to component of the tradition. And it's been getting a greater deal of attention since the end of the Cold War and the humanitarian interventions of the 90s, and of course now. The attention by secular theorists who look at this tend to look at just peace as being about, let's first assume that there was a just war, and then let's talk about the justice obligations of victors and occupying forces. And so not surprisingly, the criteria that come up are entirely within the rubric of just peace, of just war tradition, of traditional just war tradition. And my suggestion is that is absolutely insufficient and very distorting, because almost all of the conflict around the world today, there's not a just war that precedes it. And there are still justice requirements. And we also have to talk about beyond the ethics of victors and occupiers, because most conflict is civil war, and most conflict does not end in a clear one victor over another, and that there are still very severe requirements and moral obligations for justice in those circumstances. So if we can conscribe our conversation to this, we're not doing any help to the people who most need this conversation about what are the moral obligations in building peace after conflict. So we have to move beyond that, and in that way I find the Catholic Church very enriching in that, and I suggest different criteria from what's been suggested by more of the secular theorists, that's saying we don't have to assume a just war. This is can be totally divorced from that, and is even more required when the war preceding was quite unjust. So I take your comment very, very much to heart, because I think that is a limiting and a distorting feature if we start with the just war.
Thank you, Marianne. Since the topic is the future of Catholic peace building, I think it's fitting that many of us have stressed work that is yet to be done, especially in engaging the secular world, thinking things through, bringing case studies and best practices to the attention of a broader public. So that effort is part and parcel of what's brought us here tonight. And in closing, I'd like again to thank Gaplo Biondo and the Woodstock Center for their lead in the sponsorship here at Georgetown, and especially Marianne for really being the driving force behind tonight's event. So thank you all for coming, and please join me in thanking the panelists once again.
I will see you in Notre Dame.